Accepting the material body and formless mind as a thing of impermanence, accepting the inevitability of suffering as just the same, and finally reconciling with these arduous truths in the breath. Thich Nhat Hanh's book, Transformation and Healing, the Sutra on the Four Establishments of Mindfulness, lays the very framework of contemporary mindfulness by providing a digestible analysis of the Buddhist Sutra on the body, feelings, mind, and dharmas, or objects of the mind. In Chapter 5, Han champions the idea from the sutra that to bring full awareness to these four establishments is soteriological, and it can bring us such freedoms as soon as we practice it. He also underscores the three fundamental observations of Buddhism: impermanence, selflessness, and interdependent organization, as being paramount to mindfully observing the self. The main argument I want to focus on in this review is whether or not the contemporary mindfulness we are familiar with requires a backbone of religious context in order for it to be most effective in clinical practice. This is a rather controversial statement, to say the least, but I want to entertain the regressive but affirmative stance to practice within a broader path aimed at liberation rather than a narrow one focused on stress reduction, so as to better understand Thich Nhat Hanh's perspective. There's been quite a bit of discourse regarding the westernization of mindfulness, namely Jon Kabat-Zinn's emphasis on present moment and non-judgmental awareness, in MBSR extending to MBCT as well. This is rather aligned with Han's first exercise, conscious breathing, which emphasizes complete awareness of the breath so as to stay in the present and not be imprisoned by worries of the past or future. Han's third exercise is also noteworthy: oneness of the body and mind, where we hold our sensations in awareness and deep observation. It is here he cites one part of the Buddhist Eightfold Path, right concentration, where there are correct ways in which we interact with suffering, rather than incorrectly running away from it. This correlates with the MBCT program's idea of reactivity and being able to break negative loops to regulate intense emotions. Despite these junctions, Western mindfulness does not seem to have at least the same spiritual and philosophical principles one can glean from Buddhist esotericism. According to a 2025 study by Boxer et al., that had participants undertake the much stricter Lam-Rim meditation of the Buddhist stream and compare it to the Western alternative, they cited the former as much clearer in its instruction. The participants explained that Buddhist mindfulness was more like a lifestyle rather than something focused solely on productivity outcomes, and that the Western iteration would benefit more from including ideas of impermanence and the 51 qualities of the mind in teachings. In Han's ninth exercise, Body as Impermanent, he says that we must ruminate on our form as a decomposing corpse to reconcile with the fact that we will eventually cease to be. In Han's 16th exercise, Discriminatory Investigation, he emphasizes that the mind and dharmas involve the sense organs, objects, and consciousness, and those are independent and arise, endure, and fade away based on each other. I feel these areas give a more spiritual justification as to why contemporary Western mindfulness might be dangerous for some. Han says that such practices should not be done by those who have not mastered desire or aversion. A recent review by Matko and Dam explains that mindfulness can have adverse effects like traumatic re-experiencing and hallucinations. The untrained or vulnerable mind may not be receptive to programs that operate on productivity and reduction of negativity. To master such may require a stricter, broader approach that Buddhism provides. Another angle worth exploring is whether or not secularization of mindfulness has made contemporary mindfulness more vulnerable to dilution. In other words, McMindfulness. Sullivan and Arat's article on this phenomenon acknowledges both, that Buddhism can and cannot be completely severed from contemporary mindfulness, but one point stood out to me. Where Buddhism preaches moderation objectively, Secularized mindfulness is malleable and can be manipulated into being about churning out results. If we are using programs like MBCT and MBSR as a way to maximize productivity and profit for corporations, that directly goes against the very principles of which mindfulness was founded on. It is counterintuitive to be manipulating mindfulness this way if we are to base it on the Buddhist philosophy that overindulgence causes harm. The most integral argument missing from the discourse of this book, however, is that it lacks a robust ethical framework for a variety of settings, whereas MBSR and MBCT do. If a sila, or code of virtue in Buddhist terms, synonymous with the Eightfold Path, were employed and tailored to classrooms or offices, for example, perhaps it would make Buddhist mindfulness application more favorable and accessible to a larger demographic. Citing Han once more, unhappiness is truly rooted in our attachment to impermanent things. Adding a personal perspective to this review, I've noticed that times of discontentment are often because of something not going to plan. Bringing awareness to a lack of something I feel is essential to life functioning. This book has made me realize just how futile these ruminations are, because at the end of the day, as Thich Nhat Hanh illustrates in his remarks, birth, decay, and ceasing to be are the sole elements of existence, and all we can do is show them gratitude. Since suffering is just as fleeting, the best I can do is embrace it as part of me and move forward. One puzzle that remains, however, and something that I've actually been thinking about after reading the book, is how to act in a way that shows appreciation rather than desire. One controversy that arises in Buddhism is to what extent desire is a thing to be destroyed. Of course, in contemporary mindfulness, to want to destroy something felt by the self goes against the principle of non-judgment. But I still feel that some amount of divorce from desire is essential in realizing that nothing lasts forever, something that can bring a lot of peace. Han suggests that the overindulgence that arises from desire is what makes necessities like food and water harmful. To resolve my confusion on this differentiation, I feel as though informal practices like mindful eating and observing can be employed to truly access the mind and dharmas to gauge just how much of something is really needed until it becomes too much. To conclude, there is one conversation I would have liked to have had with Thich Nhat Hanh regarding the principle of non-duality, and to what point and to what extent identifying with our negative experiences can become dangerous if done incorrectly. Essentially, what would happen if we did not achieve the stage of transformation, becoming stagnant in a state of being one with unpleasantness? It may be worth exploring whether or not identification is truly correlated with impermanence. I would suggest a qualitative study design to investigate, post-intervention, whether or not participants would truly be able to transform their unpleasant feeling after undergoing practices that involve accepting it as part of themselves. In my opinion, transformation and healing compellingly argues that mindfulness thrives when practiced within the original Buddhist frame. I have found ways to identify with it, and studies have elucidated other populations feeling the same. To balance it with the cultural sensitivity secularized mindfulness brings to the table, the first step would be to teach mindfulness as a lifestyle and educate participants on the philosophical principles Thich Nhat Hanh discusses in his book, so they truly understand the state they are practicing to reach.